Hello friends, it's Juliana Michaels, and in today's video, I've got something a little different to share with you. I've joined together with my friend Luise to participate in one of her 5-item swaps. Back in January of this year, I reached out to Luise to learn more about junk journaling, and as we chatted, she invited me to collaborate with her for one of her 5-item swaps. If you aren't familiar with this, it's basically a challenge where you send each other 5 random items, then you each use those 5 items, a base such as a tag, card, or other piece of paper from your stash, and then nothing else except mediums and tools such as pastes, paint, ink, stamps, and dies to make the project. It's that simple. We, of course, decided to add a little twist to it by sending each other 5 items, but also keeping 5 of the same items for ourselves so that each of us will make and share 2 projects. In this first video, I'm sharing what I made with the 5 items I sent to Luise, and in my next video, I'll share what I made with what she sent me. So, make sure you visit her channel. I'll have it linked down below so you can see what she made with what I sent her and what she sent me. Now for the scoop on what from Mars to Mexico means. After we had decided on doing the swap, and we had each shipped each other our packages, I discovered that Luise had never received her package, and when I checked the tracking, it had gone from Mars, which is where I live, to Mexico. I thought for sure it was lost for good. Then one day, it mysteriously showed up, and our 5-item swap was back on. I, meanwhile, had received her package and had put it to the side, waiting as patiently as possible for her to get her package. By the time mine finally arrived, we were both quite busy with other commitments, so we decided to get through those before we focused on creating and sharing our 5-item swap. Well, today is the day for me to finally share what I created with the 5 items I sent Luise. And I'll start off with saying I really had no idea what I was going to do with what I sent her until I sat down and started creating. It was actually quite a challenge, but I thoroughly enjoyed the creative process and stepping outside my comfort zone a little to create in a totally new way. And because Luise has gotten me hooked on junk journaling, I decided to create something to go on my newest junk journal, which I hope to share with you once it's completed. So here's a look at the 5 items I sent her. First up is this coffee sticker that I get in my coffee orders. If you know me, you know I love skeletons and coffee, so I thought this would be fun. I included this arched window die cut from chipboard and this funky ribbon that has such a cool organic style to it. I then added this linen-like paper with the script font on it and this metallic floral printed paper. I thought it was just something a little different, and when I first saw it, I immediately wanted to know what Luise would do with it. Before I started creating, I decided that I wanted to create a tag to put in my junk journal. Tags are kind of like cards for me, so I thought it would be a great starting point. I used the largest tag die from the scrapbook.com nested tag die set and used it to cut a piece of distress heavy stock. I then trimmed it down to be 4 inches wide so it would fit in my journal. As I contemplated on what to do with this metallic floral paper, I decided to just go for it and fussy cut some of the flowers from the paper. I'm not going to bore you with watching me do all the fussy cutting, but it took me about 10 minutes, and I ended up with 3 clusters of flowers. I then had a bit of scrap left over that I wanted to save, as I thought I could stamp on the back side of the paper and use it to create a sentiment or an area with text somewhere on the tag. Next, I moved on to the script paper, and I tore it at a diagonal so I could layer a section of it over the left-hand side of the tag. I then added some black texture paste through the skull stencil for a bit of texture and set this to the side to dry. I then took my tag base and decided to do some ink smishing with Rusty Hinge and then salvaged patina Distress Oxide inks. Once the ink was dry, I then added some stamping using images from the Tim Holtz examination and the obscure stamp sets. The ink I used was black soot archival ink for something permanent, so I wouldn't have to worry about it bleeding since I didn't know what I was going to do just yet. But as you can see, there's a little bit of a Halloween theme going on here. Once I had the stamping completed, I went back to the paper I had stenciled with the paste. The paste was dry now, and I had already decided I wanted to add some color to it with some mica spray stains. And this is where things went way off track. And by the time I finished with the sprays and then layered it on the tag base, I was like, yuck. I did not like what I had made, and there was no redoing it. The colors totally clashed, especially the Rusty Hinge with the burned ember mica spray. I was like, what have I done, and how am I going to fix this? Normally, if this sort of thing happened, I would just start over with a new piece of paper. But I did not have a new piece of paper to start over with because I'd sent the rest of it to Luise. So while I contemplated on what to do about the background, I decided to paint the chipboard piece with black soot distress paint. And as always, when I use paint, I get it everywhere and all over myself, so it took me a bit to get things cleaned up. In an attempt to take down the shine of the metallic paper, I rubbed a piece of sandpaper over it. The tool I'm using is a Ranger sanding disc. It did add a little bit of distress to the images, but it really didn't do much for taking down the shine, so I decided to embrace them as is and move on. One of the things I tried to do to save the tag was to add some walnut stain Distress Oxide. This definitely toned things down, but I still wasn't loving it. And here I'm just futzing around with the various items, trying to figure out what to do next. At this point, I decided to fussy cut the skeleton from the sticker. Again, I'm not going to bore you with this step, but it took me about 6 minutes to cut it out. Here I'm trying to figure out how to use that ribbon. I thought about putting it behind the chipboard window, but it seemed to get lost when I did that. I then continued to try to make the background pieces work, and here I'm adhering the script paper to the tag base. Because I wasn't totally committed to using it, I only used one strip of tape to adhere it in place. Once I got the paper adhered, I trimmed off the excess and then began playing around with the placement of the other items. At this point, I felt like the chipboard needed something more, so I decided to add some shimmer and shine and sprayed it with some Iron Gate mica stain. I then dried the ink with my heat tool. Now I'm back to that ribbon, and because I have plenty of it here, I decided to cut it into some smaller pieces that I could tuck behind the skeleton. I then go back to futzing around with everything and even trying replacing the tag with the script paper to try and tone down the color of the skeleton and give myself a few more minutes as I contemplate the background once more. Here I'm adding mushroom and sepia alcohol ink to the sticker. I applied the ink to a piece of felt that I applied to my blending tool, and then I pounced the ink onto the sticker to darken it and add a touch of grunge. Once I placed the inked sticker onto the background I had created, I made the final decision to redo my background with something a little less obnoxious. I recut another tag from Distress Heavy Stock and inked the edges with walnut stained Distress Oxide ink using a blending tool. Next, I took the extra script paper I still had, retore it to fit the tag, adhered it to the tag, and trimmed off the excess. This time around, I decided to keep it a bit more simple for the background, so I just inked the edges of the paper with some walnut stained Distress Oxide ink. Here I'm back to futzing around with the placement of things. From the beginning, I had hoped to add in some greenery die cuts somehow, and the back side of the metallic paper was really the only thing I had that might work. But I wanted it to kind of match the color of the leaves on the coffee sticker, so here I'm doing some ink smushing of that paper into some salvaged patina Distress Oxide ink. This, of course, is way too bright, so to tone it down, I applied some walnut stained Distress Oxide ink using my blending tool. I then spritzed this with some water to activate the oxide and dried it with my heat tool. Off camera, I die cut 3 pieces of greenery from the inked paper, and I even had enough for one more of the top sections of the greenery. The dye set I used was the Tim Holtz Garden Greens Thinlits dyes. I was super careful in how I placed the dyes on that little scrap of paper and was able to cut them all out, plus have a little left over to do some stamping for some text that I wanted to add. I then worked out how I wanted to arrange them behind the skeleton sticker and created a little cluster to embellish the chipboard window. Here I'm finally starting to adhere the metallic floral paper, and I do mess around with it for a bit to get each piece just where I want it. As you can see, I'm quite the futzer when it comes to committing to the final placement on things. Next, I take the ribbon and cut a piece of it in half, and I've decided to add a little shimmer, so I decided to add some Distress Foundry wax in Statue. After making sure it's well mixed, I applied it to the ribbon with my finger and then directly from the bottle. I then used my heat tool to set the wax and make it permanent on the ribbon. If you don't apply the heat, the wax will just rub off. And in the process of applying the heat, the wax transforms from kind of boring to this super shiny metallic finish. Here I'm back to futzing around some more with all of the pieces, and I've decided to add more of the ribbon, so I repeat the process of adding the Distress Foundry wax to these pieces of the ribbon. Now it's time to start assembling things, and silly me, I've decided to remove the backing from the sticker so I could adhere the die cuts to it. Yes, that works. But now I'm dealing with a flimsy vinyl sticker, so I end up putting the liner back onto the sticker to make it more sturdy. Of course, I don't get it lined up quite exactly, so I've just used my scissors to trim off the excess liner. As I mentioned earlier, I saved a small scrap of that metallic floral paper to do some stamping on, and I picked a couple of stamps from the Tim Holtz Tiny Text Halloween and Examination stamp sets. I told you there was a Halloween theme going on here. I then played around with the best way to fit the stamps onto that small piece of paper. Here I'm stamping in my Misty stamping platform, and I'm using black soot archival ink. I then stamp the rest of the long text so that I will have all the words, and then I trim off the excess paper around the stamped pieces. I like to use my paper trimmer for this, but you can also just use scissors. I then inked the edges of these with some walnut stained Distress Oxide ink so that they would coordinate with my other embellishments. The small pharmacy label seems a little lost and plain, so I started playing around with the script paper that I had stenciled and sprayed on back at the beginning. I mean, why waste that? So I cut a piece of that off to layer behind the stamped piece. Earlier, I'd plugged in my glue gun to adhere the ribbon, so here I'm using it to attach the ribbon to the chipboard window. I decided to use a glue gun here because it dries fast, and I didn't want to wait for a regular liquid adhesive to dry. A little trick I learned recently is you can use a heat tool to get rid of those pesky glue gun strings. The heat causes them to shrink up and disappear. At this point, the battery on my camera died and I didn't realize it, but while it was dead, I had tried a few more things to layer behind the pharmacy label stamp. One of them was to paint the backside of the script paper with black soot distress paint, and that is what I ended up using. I adhered them together and then used my scissors to trim that down to create a matte layer behind the stamped image. This other little piece is also a scrap from that same paper that I ruined earlier. On the back side of it, I first inked it with some salvaged patina Distress Oxide ink, and then decided to add some Distress Foundry wax and statue over the top of that. I then attached all the layers together and adhered the label to my tag. Here I'm finally trimming off the excess of the metallic floral paper as I've finally decided that I'm happy with their placement. Next, I begin to adhere the text with an adhesive runner, but then I decided that I want more dimensions, so I grabbed a roll of double-sided foam tape to adhere them. And of course, I futz around a bit with them before I finally settle on their placement. I then adhered the greenery and skeleton cluster to the chipboard window. But before I adhered the window cluster to the tag, I added a little more walnut stained Distress Oxide ink to the edges just to darken it up a little more. I spritzed it with some water and then dried it with my heat tool. I still wanted it a little darker, so I added a little more ink and repeated the process of the spritzing and drying. Well, here's a look at my finished tag. Off camera, I added some machine stitching with black sewing thread around the edges and then adhered the window cluster to the tag. I also decided to add some grit paste to cut down on the shine from that metallic floral paper. To do that, I applied a layer of Distress Collage Medium, let that dry, and then applied the grit paste. The collage medium helps the grit paste adhere better, especially on this metallic paper. I then added some alcohol inks in rust, butterscotch, mushroom, and espresso until I was happy with how it looked. I did a pretty good job with using the items, but I still have some left, so I'm going to challenge myself to use them somewhere in this junk journal. I also saved that original tag I inked and stamped on to use as well. I really love all the texture, dimension, and shine I was able to create with these 5 items. It was such a fun process, and it made me realize how such a challenge was a good way to step outside my crafting comfort zone. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of how this tag came together. I know I sped through a lot of it, but if I didn't do that, this video would have been over 2 hours long. Don't forget to head over to Luise's channel to see what she's created. And as I mentioned earlier, I've got links to her video in the description box below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. I'm so grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel, or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.